Morgan Freeman's unexpected response. The studio lights beamed down on the stage, casting a golden hue on the legendary Morgan Freeman as he sat comfortably in a plush leather chair. The audience was packed with eager fans, all waiting to hear the wisdom that only his deep, resonant voice could deliver. The host, Mark Reynolds, a well-known but sometimes reckless TV personality, was known for his sharp wit and provocative questions. Tonight's interview was meant to be lighthearted, a celebration of Freeman's illustrious career. But Mark had a habit of pushing boundaries. Halfway through the interview, he leaned forward, smirking slightly. "Morgan," he began, "you've played God, presidents, wise old men, basically, you're Hollywood's go-to guy for wisdom. But tell me, do you ever get tired of just being the old, wise man?" The question was met with a few chuckles from the audience, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Freeman, ever the composed gentleman, smiled, but his eyes carried a glint of something deeper. Before he could respond, Mark chuckled and added, "I mean, let's be real. At this point, they could just replace you with AI and no one would notice." The audience gasped. A murmur spread across the studio. The joke had crossed a line. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Morgan Freeman leaned forward, steepling his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was as smooth as ever but carried the weight of something profound. "Mark," he said, his gaze locking onto the host, "do you know why people still listen when I speak?" Mark, caught off guard, blinked. Because of your voice?" A few people chuckled nervously, but Freeman remained serious. "No," he said. "It's because I choose my words carefully. Because when I speak, I do not speak to fill the silence, I speak to give it meaning." The room was completely still. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Freeman continued. "A voice is just a sound. But wisdom is the weight behind the words. AI can replicate my voice, but it cannot replicate my experiences, my thoughts, or my soul. And that, my friend, is why they will never replace me." The silence in the studio stretched for a few more seconds before the audience erupted into applause. People were on their feet, clapping, some even whistling. Mark, clearly flustered, forced a smile. "Well, Morgan, I think you just proved exactly why you're still here." Freeman chuckled, the tension dissipating. "Indeed, Mark. And I plan to be here for a long time." The interview went viral. The clip was shared millions of times, and people around the world hailed Freeman's response as one of the most powerful mic drops in TV history. And from that day on, no one ever joked about replacing Morgan Freeman again. The interview didn't just go viral, it became a cultural moment. The internet exploded with praise for Morgan Freeman's wisdom. Memes, quotes, and reaction videos flooded social media. Some people called it the greatest comeback in television history. Others debated the deeper meaning behind his words. Mark Reynolds, however, was in a different situation. While some defended him, saying he was just doing his job as a provocative host, many criticized his lack of respect. That night, after the show wrapped up, Mark sat in his dressing room, staring at his phone. His social media was blowing up, but not in the way he had hoped. He had always prided himself on being edgy, but this time, he had gone too far. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, rubbing his temples. The door opened, and to his surprise, Morgan Freeman himself stepped inside, his signature calm expression unchanged. "Mind if I sit?" Freeman asked. Mark, still slightly embarrassed from the on-air moment, nodded. "Of course." Freeman sat down across from him, his hands folded in his lap. For a moment, he simply looked at Mark, as if studying him. Then, he finally spoke. You remind me of a young man I once knew, Freeman said. Mark raised an eyebrow. Oh. Was he as reckless as I am? Freeman chuckled. Worse. He thought that being bold meant being careless. That being memorable meant shocking people. He thought that being the loudest voice in the room meant he was the most important one. Mark swallowed. And what happened to him? Freeman leaned back, a small smile playing on his lips. He learned. Slowly. He realized that words have power, not just to entertain, but to inspire, to challenge, to change people. And when he understood that, he became someone worth listening to. Mark exhaled, tapping his fingers on the table. I messed up, didn't I? Freeman tilted his head. You did what you thought would make a good show. But let me ask you this, do you want to be remembered for getting laughs, or for saying something that matters? Mark didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, thinking. Finally, he nodded. I get it. And I appreciate you coming here to tell me that. Most people would just write me off as another arrogant TV host. Freeman smiled. Most people aren't me. Mark laughed, a real, genuine laugh. No, they're definitely not. Freeman stood up and extended a hand. Mark shook it. Next time, Freeman said as he walked to the door, ask a question that makes people think, not just react. Mark watched him leave, his mind racing. The next week, when Mark returned to his show, he opened with a statement. I want to take a moment to acknowledge something. Last week, I made a joke at Morgan Freeman's expense. And while he responded with wisdom and grace, I realized something important. I was using my voice for the wrong reasons. So from now on, I want to ask better questions. I want to have better conversations. I want to be someone worth listening to. The audience applauded, and somewhere, backstage, Morgan Freeman smiled. Because he knew, true wisdom is not just in the words spoken, but in the lessons learned. Mark Reynolds kept his word. In the weeks following his viral moment with Morgan Freeman, his talk show took a noticeable turn. His questions became sharper, not in the way that provoked cheap laughs, but in the way that challenged guests to reflect, to share something real. His ratings soared, not because of controversy, but because people saw something they rarely saw in the media, genuine conversations. One evening, about a month later, Mark received a letter. Not an email, not a message on social media, a handwritten letter on thick, cream-colored paper. The sender? Morgan Freeman. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Mark. Growth is a choice. And I see you have chosen wisely. You have learned what many never do, that words can build or break, and the responsibility of a voice is not to fill silence, but to give it meaning. Keep asking the right questions. Keep listening, not just hearing. And most of all, keep learning. Perhaps, one day, you'll be the one sitting in my chair, passing down wisdom to someone else who needs it. Until then, I'll be watching. Morgan. Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He folded the letter carefully, placing it in a drawer in his desk, the kind of thing you don't throw away, no matter how many years pass. That night, as he prepared for his next interview, he found himself smiling. Not because of fame. Not because of ratings. But because, for the first time in his career, he knew he was doing something that mattered. And somewhere in Hollywood, Morgan Freeman sat back in his chair, watching the show with a knowing smile. Months passed, and Mark Reynolds' show continued to evolve. It became a place where actors, musicians, scientists, and even world leaders came not just to promote their work, but to have meaningful discussions. People noticed the change. But no one noticed it more than Mark himself. One evening, as he prepared for another broadcast, his producer knocked on the door. "Mark, you're gonna want to see this." She handed him a small envelope, sealed with a wax stamp. It looked official. Mark opened it carefully and read the contents. Invitation. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences cordially invites Mark Reynolds to serve as the host of the 95th Academy Awards. Mark blinked. "Wait, this isn't a joke?" His producer grinned. "Nope. The Oscars want you." He ran a hand through his hair. Hosting the Oscars was the pinnacle of entertainment broadcasting. Only the best of the best got that honor. And yet, he had a feeling he knew exactly why they had chosen him. That night, as he sat alone in his office, he pulled out Morgan Freeman's letter once more. He read the words carefully, running his fingers over the ink. Then, without hesitating, he grabbed his phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, the familiar deep voice answered. "Mark," Morgan Freeman said, his voice warm. "To what do I owe this call?" Mark grinned. "Well, Morgan, I think it's time you gave me some advice again." Freeman chuckled. "I had a feeling you'd call." And just like that, the student and the master began another conversation, one that would shape the next great moment of Mark Reynolds' career. Mark leaned back in his chair, gripping the phone as Morgan Freeman's voice rumbled through the speaker. "So," Freeman said with a hint of amusement, "they've handed you the biggest stage in entertainment. Are you nervous?" Mark exhaled. "Honestly? More than I've ever been. I mean, this is the Oscars. Millions of people watching. One wrong joke and you'll learn from it," Freeman finished. "The only people who don't make mistakes are the ones who don't do anything." Mark chuckled. "You always know what to say, don't you?" "It's not about knowing what to say, Mark," Freeman said. "It's about knowing when to listen." That hit Mark harder than he expected. He'd spent years talking, trying to be the loudest voice in the room. Now, he was being reminded that the real magic happened when he let the moment speak for itself. "All right," Mark said. "What's your advice?" Freeman paused for a moment before responding. "Don't try to be the show," he said. "Be the bridge. The host is not the star, the host guides the audience, brings out the best in others, and sets the tone. Make them laugh, make them think, but most of all, make them feel." Mark nodded slowly, taking it in. "And one more thing," Freeman added. "If you ever get nervous, just remind yourself, no one's tuning in to watch you fail. They want you to succeed. Let them root for you." Mark let out a breath. "You know, Morgan, I think I should just have you on speed dial for life advice." Freeman chuckled. "You wouldn't be the first to say that." The night of the Oscars. The big night arrived. The Dolby Theater was packed with Hollywood's finest, all dressed in their absolute best. Millions watched from their homes, waiting for the first words to come from Mark Reynolds. As he stepped onto the grand stage, he could feel the weight of the moment. The laughter, the energy, the expectations, all of it rested on his shoulders. He adjusted his tuxedo, took a breath, and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 95th Academy Awards. You know, when I first got this gig, I thought to myself, how do I even begin to live up to the legends who have stood here before me?" A beat. The crowd listened. And then I remembered, I don't have to be anyone else. I just have to be me. Applause. The night went on smoothly. Mark kept the energy balanced, witty but respectful, entertaining but never over the top. He guided the evening like a seasoned pro. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. The next presenter was announced. The voice boomed through the theater. "Please welcome, the legendary Morgan Freeman." The audience erupted in cheers as Freeman walked onto the stage, dignified as ever. But as he reached the microphone, he paused and looked toward Mark at the side of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Freeman said, his deep voice commanding attention, "before I present this award, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge something." The room fell silent. A year ago, this man, Mark Reynolds, sat across from me on a talk show and learned a lesson about words, about respect, and about wisdom. He glanced at Mark, his eyes twinkling. Tonight, he stands on the stage, proving that he not only learned that lesson, but mastered it. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Mark, caught off guard, stood there for a moment, stunned. Then, he smiled and gave a small nod of appreciation. Freeman turned back to the microphone. "Now, let's give out an Oscar, shall we?" The rest of the night went down in history as one of the most memorable Oscars ever. The legacy of a lesson. The next morning, Mark woke up to headlines praising his performance. Mark Reynolds shines as Oscar host, and the redemption of Mark Reynolds flooded social media. But for him, the real reward wasn't in the headlines. It was in that brief moment on stage, when Morgan Freeman, the man who had once put him in his place, had now lifted him up. And as Mark sat in his dressing room, he pulled out Freeman's letter once more, reading the words that had started it all. He smiled. Because he knew, this was only the beginning. The Oscars had been a triumph, but Mark Reynolds knew that moments like that were fleeting. One night of success didn't mean the journey was over. If anything, it meant the real work was just beginning. The next morning, his phone was flooded with calls, networks, producers, even film studios wanting him to host, interview, or collaborate on new projects. He had never been more in demand. But the call he cared about the most came in the afternoon. Morgan Freeman. "Well," Freeman said when Mark picked up. "I believe congratulations are in order." Mark grinned. "I have to say, Morgan, I didn't expect you to give me a standing ovation in front of the entire industry." Freeman chuckled. "Neither did I. But credit where it's due. You didn't just perform, you understood the moment. And that, my friend, is rare." Mark hesitated. "I have to ask, why did you do that? Why take that moment to acknowledge me?" Freeman was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Because someone did it for me once." Mark leaned forward, intrigued. "Who?" Freeman sighed, as if reminiscing about a long-forgotten chapter of his life. "Sidney Poitier," he said. "When I was young and trying to make a name for myself, I made a mistake, much like you did. I was arrogant, thinking my voice alone was enough. Sidney sat me down one day and told me, a great man doesn't need to be the loudest in the room. He just needs to say the right thing at the right time." Mark listened, hanging on every word. Freeman continued, "Years later, when I stood on that stage accepting my Oscar, I thought about Sidney. About how his words shaped me. And last night, I saw the same thing in you. Growth. That's worth acknowledging." Mark was speechless for a moment. Then he finally found his voice. "I don't know what to say." "You already said it," Freeman replied. "On that stage. In your work. In the way you've changed. That's enough. A new chapter." A few weeks later, Mark received another invitation, but this one was different. It wasn't from a network, a studio, or a Hollywood elite. It was from a university. They wanted him to give a lecture on the power of words. On how a single conversation, a single moment, could change everything. As he stood before the students, preparing to speak, he thought about the road that had led him here. The reckless host who once sought shock value. The man who had been humbled by a legend. The one who learned, grew, and now had the chance to pass that lesson on. And as he spoke his first words, he smiled, because he finally understood what Morgan Freeman had been trying to teach him all along. Words had power. And he was finally using them the right way. The applause filled the auditorium as Mark Reynolds concluded his speech. Students, professors, and journalists in attendance gave him a standing ovation, not just for his words, but for the transformation they represented. As he stepped down from the podium, shaking hands and exchanging words with eager students, his phone buzzed. He glanced down. Morgan Freeman, call me when you get a moment. Mark smiled. It had become a tradition by now. Every time he reached a new milestone, Freeman always seemed to know. Later that evening, as he sat in his hotel room, he finally called. Morgan, he said, settling into a chair. I hope I didn't embarrass myself up there today. Freeman chuckled. On the contrary. You proved me right, again. Mark leaned back, exhaling. You know, I never expected to be in this position. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be standing in front of students, talking about wisdom and responsibility, I would have laughed. You weren't ready a year ago, Freeman said simply. Now you are. Mark was silent for a moment. Then he asked, so what now? Where does this all lead? Freeman's voice carried its usual weight. That depends on you, Mark. The world doesn't need more entertainers, it needs more voices of reason. More people willing to ask the right questions, challenge the right ideas, and inspire change. Mark listened intently. You have a platform, Freeman continued. Use it for something bigger than yourself. Mark sat with those words for a long moment. He had spent years chasing fame, influence, the next big moment. But now, for the first time, he saw a bigger picture. The next morning, he made a decision. The next move. Instead of returning to his usual talk show, Mark announced something unexpected, a new project. A documentary series featuring conversations with some of the greatest minds of the generation. Not just actors and celebrities, but scientists, historians, activists, and visionaries. And for the first episode, there was only one person he wanted to sit down with. Morgan Freeman. The day of the interview, as the cameras rolled and the two men sat across from each other once again, Mark smiled. Morgan, he said, it seems like every time we talk, my life changes. Freeman chuckled. That's what wisdom does, Mark. It changes people, if they're willing to listen. Mark nodded. Then let's keep talking. And so they did. For hours, for the cameras, and for the world. Because some conversations are too important not to share. The interview between Mark Reynolds and Morgan Freeman became an instant classic. It wasn't just another celebrity conversation, it was something deeper. It was about legacy, wisdom, and the responsibility that came with having a voice. Millions tuned in. People who had once dismissed Mark as just another talk show host now saw him in a different light. His growth, his transformation, it was undeniable. But the most important moment came after the cameras stopped rolling. As the crew packed up, Mark and Morgan sat alone in the dimly lit studio. You know, Morgan, Mark said, swirling the coffee in his cup, when I look back at everything, it's crazy to think that all of this started because of one moment. One mistake. Freeman smiled knowingly. Growth always begins with a mistake. It's what you do next that matters. Mark nodded. So, what's next for you? Freeman leaned back, exhaling. Oh, I'll keep telling stories, keep sharing what I can. But my time in the spotlight is nearing its natural end. Mark frowned. Don't say that. The world still needs your voice. Freeman studied him for a moment, then chuckled. Maybe. But you see, Mark, that's the thing about wisdom. It doesn't belong to one person forever. It's meant to be passed down. And I think I've passed a little bit of it down to you. Mark sat with that for a moment. He wasn't sure if he was ready to accept it, but deep down, he knew Morgan was right. Then I guess I have a responsibility now, Mark said. Freeman nodded. Yes. And from what I've seen, I think you're finally ready for it. 1 year later. Mark Reynolds stood on a different stage now, not the Oscars, not a talk show set, but a TED Talk in front of thousands. The topic? The power of words, how one conversation changed my life. He spoke about his past, his failures, and the lesson Morgan Freeman had taught him. He spoke about the responsibility of influence, of listening, of understanding the weight of what we say. And somewhere, watching from home, Morgan Freeman smiled. Because the true mark of wisdom isn't in how much you know, it's in how well you pass it on. And in Mark Reynolds, he knew the lesson would live on.